Starting with the file forest B4, we have the current scene, and there is one thing that we noticed in the previous lesson, and that was there wasn't a whole lot of detail on the terrain. Because the material itself doesn't have a lot of color information, it's going to be quicker to just add detail to the terrain itself, and we can do that pretty easily by converting it to a procedural terrain. The procedural terrain will take the current 2D layer and add procedural data to it, subdividing and adding polygons throughout to create a lot of extra detail, which was really going to help in ambient lit situations and areas of shadow. The only problem is we're going to lose the ecosystem we currently have, or at least the position, because we have static population. Now for the fill layer, or the small plants, being the second layer, the small trees, it's not a big deal. Large trees, I mean, technically isn't, because the only thing I modified was just deleting that one tree in front, and I can do that again. But in case you're in a situation where you've created a large ecosystem, or you've painted different areas and defined it in ways that you'd like to preserve, then another method needs to be used because we just don't want to lose that information. Now, like I said, in this case, I don't really care in this scene, but for the most part, just in case you do want to preserve it, I'm going to show you a technique to be able to do that. It starts with copying and pasting the terrain. And if we select the first terrain and delete it, you'll also notice that the ecosystem was copied and pasted over. Well, I'm going to go ahead and undo that deleting. And in this case, it looks like undo also, because I removed the second terrain, did delete the ecosystem. So I'm going to reload the file. So it looks like the undo is not going to be useful with that. So I'm just going to reload it and I'll show you this technique here. So we'll select the terrain, copy, paste, and what we want to do is just have the ecosystem preserved on one of the terrains and use the other terrain to modify the landscape. And we can also take care of the ground materials that way, or the ground vegetation layer, so we could have a separate ecosystem for that. And the reason I'm doing this before moving on to the very small ecosystem or the ground population is because that really needs to conform to the terrain, because there's going to be a slight modification of the height. But for the larger trees, it's not going to matter as much. For perfect preservation, it is possible to use a very minimal procedural to minimize the amount of elevation change, but we should be okay. It shouldn't cause that much of an issue. So what I want to do is go to first decide which is going to be the terrain we keep. I'm going to use terrain 1 to keep the ecosystem. So what we need to do is modify a few things here. I'm going to go over to terrain 2, and since we're not going to have the ecosystem on here, what I'm going to do is delete the ecosystem layers. Keeping in mind we will lose the ability to use the affinity because we don't have the same ecosystem layer if we were to apply an ecosystem to this. But I just want to make sure that our names for the materials are going to be separated and different and not the exact same material applied. If we open the output observer, it does look like it updated and gave us a separate ecosystem, sometimes with the same names or a separate material. Sometimes with the same names it will overwrite. So I'm just going to call this landscape 2 and just add the 2 after all of the material names just to be sure. Okay, so now we can modify that terrain and not have to worry about the ecosystem. The other terrain, what we need to do is make it hidden from the render. Now normally what I'd do is convert the ecosystem over to the global ecosystem. In this case, in my version, because once again I'm using the pre-release, that currently is unavailable to me. I did report it, by the way, so it should be fixed by the time of the final release. So you could also convert that over the global ecosystem. But it's also useful to be able to have these doubled up material ecosystems based on objects as well. And what I want to do is basically just remove the other materials, delete the different layers. And now this main layer might be able to do, I'm going to check, it will not show up as a layered ecosystem because of the, or a layered material because of the ecosystem. So we can't select those by right-clicking within the aspect tab, or the object properties if you're using the integrated version within the host application. So what we need to do is just clear out some of these functions. So we're going to edit the function, right-click, edit function. So what we're going to do is just highlight all of the function, hit delete, to basically clear everything out. I'm going to rename this material null, this material layer, go to transparency, and enable global transparency to 100%. That way we still have the ecosystem, and the other terrain should show through. And it does look like it's causing a bit of an error. So what I'm going to do is go back to that material, the null material, edit the alpha production, add in a constant node, the value of 1. It looks like we still might be seeing that through the render. So I'm going to select at the top here, right next to the render settings, or the render, the use render area, and then we can drag out and just select an area to render and just see if that's just the preview or if it is showing up. It does look like there's a little bit of a problem there. So I am going to discard the render area, and it looks like maybe we won't be able to make this transparent. Because the problem is if we hide it from the render, it is also going to hide the ecosystem. I have had success with this in the past, so I'm not quite sure why it is having an issue at the moment. So I tried a couple of other things, and it doesn't appear to be working right now. I think it has to do with the fact that there's an alpha there. So what I'm going to do instead is edit the object and go into the clipping and just clip out the terrain all the way. And that will basically flatten it out. So just as long as we're not doing any further populations within that terrain, it'll be fine. So that's one way you can preserve it. Looks like with the terrain then, definitely just clip it out. And that way we have kind of a null object that is going to house the ecosystem. And that does work similarly to the way the global ecosystem object works when you have a painted terrain. So now we're going to modify the second terrain, or the terrain that is left here. And we're going to go to first save out a version of the scene. And since I'm making a major change here, this is going to become C01 because we're converting it to a procedural, and we've made a lot of changes to different items in the scene, and I think that's a pretty big change. So now we'll go back into the terrain editor, click no because we don't want to resample the images, and up at the upper left we have the terrain options. What we're going to do is switch this over from a standard to a procedural. I'm also going to just, for the moment, increase the clipping range. And we have a couple of new tabs here. Procedural tab and zones. What we're going to worry about right now is just the altitude production of the procedural. Now, if you want to use a preset, you can double-click and open up any of the functions. There are different terrain altitudes and fractals you can load in. Any file that ends in FNC, which is the function file. I've also got a lot of my own personal ones that currently need updated previews. But that will allow you to just click on a function. Let's just load one in. And then you can see how it is affecting the terrain, which is making a major change at the moment. If we wanted to reduce that effect, we could edit the filter and just reduce down on the right. In this case, it looks like it's subtracting a lot, but we're not going to be using that. So I'm just going to go ahead and reset the filter and reset the function. And what I'm going to do is edit the function to open up the altitude production and add in a fractal node. So over on the left, add a fractal node. And then what we can do is choose the type of fractal we want to use. And I'm going to switch this over to the terrain fractal. Now, because we are in an object parametric mode, the scaling is going to be really large. As of View 9, the way the scales work has changed a lot. And typically, if you were to create a new procedural terrain, it would have a multiply math node. So we went to math node, add multiply. With that selected, we can click on the link and add another math node, which will duplicate the previous choice. So since we had a multiply, it'll automatically connect it. And that way you can avoid any time spent connecting it. And then we would normally see a value of 128 set, which increases the detail then, and we can see the different scales. So what I'm going to do is just remove the metascale and increase the largest feature amount just to get some nice detail throughout. Adjust the smooth area, altitude, switch us over to billows, add a little distortion, and bump surge is going to be important because that's going to be how much the terrain is really modified. Same thing with the smooth area altitude. The more change we see, the more it's going to affect our 2D layer. So what we can also do is reduce the gain to prevent the output from going too far. So if we take a look, we can see in the node preview that we are well within the range of 1 to -1. Go ahead and click OK. And we just see a slight change to the shape of the terrain. And if we need to modify that output, we can go back in and create some additional changes. I'm also going to go through and just crop that out. So clipping it, click OK. And it looks like maybe that is too much of a detailed change because we have items that are going below, or looks like ecosystem going trees above the terrain. So what we can do is select the output, the terrain fractal, and the link to the altitude, add in a filter. And what we're going to do is use the map filter. Now the default settings on this might actually work, but to understand how this works, what it does is it takes a specific input range and then converts it to another range, either stretching or reducing. So since at the moment our range seems to be between 0.1 and -0.3, what we can do is set 0.1 for the upper value and -0.3 for the lower value. And with that set, we can now control exactly how we want the output to be. It looks like it might be going a little bit outside that range that I had set. So let's go ahead and set that to -0.4 and 0.2 for the upper. And that looks pretty close. So I want my lower value to be 0 and my upper value 0.1. And actually we'll try 0.2. And let's see how well that affects it. That should be pretty good. Click OK. And that seemed to conform pretty well. Might need to adjust the height of the terrain, but we do have a lot more detail that is going to show up in there now. If we need to modify ranges further, one thing I would suggest doing in this case because we do have very minimal range, I'm going to go ahead and set this to 0.3 and then change that largest feature option. And that added a lot more smaller details throughout. In this case, it's kind of messing up the path. So that might be a little too large. Decrease bump surge. Increase ridge smoothness. We'll go ahead and switch this over to ridges as well, instead of billows, for the noise type. And if it extends outside the clipping range, you can just reset the clip. Okay, so that should be good. To start with, if I need to reduce the height of the terrain, we could just lower it. And it didn't really seem like much of a change before because of the way the camera was being bumped. So now as we lower it, the camera is also moving kind of with it. And we can fit that a little bit better. So if we do a render area, and I'm just going to grab this section over here, just kind of draw that out, we should see a lot more detail on the terrain, which should make it look a lot better in the render. Okay, so now we can move on to adding in our ground vegetation. Now, I've already created some custom plants that I want to use for the forest floor that will create sticks and dead leaves. I do want to show you how they were created because they do use custom image maps from the asileFX leaves collection. So I want to show you that really quick before I go ahead and load them in. So in case you do have access to these other texture maps, or you want to use even just ones from other objects to kind of create the same effect, you'll be able to understand how that is done. So I just have another window open of view, and I did set the internal unit to 0.1. What I'm going to do is right click to load in a plant, and we're going to go to grasses and plants and load in the lily of the valley. It's a good ground cover plant. What I also want to do is go to the atmosphere editor and turn off the wind and breeze, because it will completely modify the shape of the plant. And it looks like my system is lagging a little bit because I have both windows open. The other one has a lot of ecosystems in it, so we'll see how well this performs. If I need to, I'll close out the other window. But I'm going to edit the object, and we have two subsets. On the left for the trunk and branches, I'm going to reduce their height so that we're just really dealing with the leaf polygons. And we have 5 different subsets of leaves. And what I want to do is replace the image maps. So we're going to go to the new leaf petal map, and I'm going to load in an image. So first thing I'm going to load in is a color production of a leaf. And now, because these are named in a sequence, it's going to ask me if I want to load the whole image sequence, which will create an animation. I'm going to select no. And then it's going to give me a warning about alpha maps. Now, if you do own the Leaves collection, the current release does not have embedded alpha maps. My personal collection does. That will be coming out in a future update. So depending on when you watch this, it may be available. If not, and the alpha has not been assigned, then you will need to also load in the alpha map. So this is number 26. Go to the alpha, and then I can load in number 26, the clip, and load that image in separately. So what we need to do, and most leaves end up pointing downward where we have the stem on the top. That's just really the way they connect the leaves. It works better. So what I'm going to do is rotate both of these. Now, because it has an embedded alpha, the image is going to show up kind of bad for the overlapping. But you can still see that leaf showing. And then we can also see it in the preview. It is stretched a little bit, or squished. The reason for that is because it is using the options set by the length and width to display it. So it's also a good indication of how you need to modify the length and width. In case the randomness is really distorting it, or if you're working with a tree and it's difficult to tell, then what you can do is open that back up, and now you can see, after making changes, basically how it's going to look with those settings. So now we can see the dead leaf added. If we want to apply additional changes, we're going to edit the material, so right-click, Edit Material, go to the highlights, and remove the highlight intensity, setting it to 0, because I don't want any highlights on this dead leaf. Then we're going to go to the bump channel, right-click, and edit the function. I'm going to delete the setup for the bump, add in a texture map, and then load in the bump for this leaf. And then we want to rotate it around so that it stems back at the top. And whenever you're modifying bump, you always want to set it in interpolation type. And we're going to set that to bilinear, because otherwise it's going to look really jagged. I'm going to set my depth to 0.2. And that is pretty much ready to go. And we can also, another good idea is to rename the material. So now we have dead leaves added in. What we can do is add a bit of flexibility so they're not all pointing up, and also reduce the curl a little bit, and those will flatten out a bit more. So now we can go through each of these subsets and assign different images. I'm just going to add one more. What I'm going to do is add in some sticks from the stick folder as part of the leaves collection. We could just choose a stick that we want to use. Go ahead and rotate that around both the alpha as well. Connect the hooking point to the end of the stick, and I can also tell that this one is going to need an increased width. And if I want to make this closer to the relation of the leaf, I can increase both the length and the width, or decrease the size of the leaf. Set up a little bit of flexibility, reduce curl. And then do the same thing as before to assign the bump map as the previous subset. So this is what I've done to create my own variations. Just to add some ground cover. And I've created a couple of different ones. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out. We're going to go back to the other scene. Select the procedural terrain. We now need to add an ecosystem. We're going to call this Groundcover. And then we're going to, and actually if we want to, there's one thing I did forget before, which I wanted to do, and that is have larger dead trees. So let's do another large tree layer. Call it Large Trees Dead. Do that first, and then if we add a ground cover after that, we can, if you wanted to, use the affinity with layer to group those around the dead trees like all the leaves had fallen off of those trees, along with having some additional spread throughout. So that's just kind of one thing we can do. So I'm going to add a couple of large or dead trees. Go to Plant, Trees, we'll use the large dead tree as one of them. Add a plant. I'm also going to select the Plum Tree Winter. Add a plant, and we'll do the Leafless Tree Old and Dead. And then we'll just modify some of the scales up and down, do an overall distribution. If needed, remove them from the path, either the same way as before with the alpha, or just doing it with the brush. So if we populate, let's take a look at the scales. Plum Tree is always going to be a bit smaller, so we'll take the large dead tree and set that to 0.08. The Leafless Tree Old, Really can't tell at the moment where that's at. I think it's right in front of the camera, probably around the same size as a large dead tree. That should be okay. I am going to take the density and bring it down because we don't want this fully covered with these trees. We'll populate. And it looks like there aren't any on the path, which is good. The plum tree winter, I'm going to reduce the amount of those to a presence of 0.2. And now we've got some dead trees spread about. So now we'll go and add the ground layer. Select that dirt path, ecosystem, bump this layer up, and call it ground cover. Click OK, and I'm also going to save the scene at this point. So going back to the material and in the ground cover, I'm going to add in all of those plants. So my ground cover that I created, just a couple of them. I've got dead leaves. I've also got one for sticks and one for like seeds and various items you might find on a forest floor. These I'm also using very high-resolution textures, so they might take a little bit longer to render or load in the variations. Okay, so I have those 3 loaded in, and I'll probably end up adding some other plants too, some smaller plants. Now, because I don't really have any idea of what the scale is of these plants in relation to the rest of the scene, I don't just want to hit populate, because it might reach a very high number of instances, and it's just going to slow me down. So what I'm going to start with is going to the overall scaling and just increasing it up. Populate it just to see how many we have. I'm going to go to the maximum size variation and set that to 0.1, and then just start scaling it down. I really don't want these huge, something small, but not too small. So I will go back to the maximum size variation. It looks like the variations themselves from the solid growth are changing the scales enough that I don't really need to have an overall scale. So just going back, reducing that, because we can see the amount of instances reaching a pretty high amount. What you can also do is go to the density and reduce the density if needed while you're manipulating and figuring out what scale you want to use. I'm going to set these down to 1, populate it. Just that slight change has made a big difference in the amount of time it takes to populate. Okay, so it looks like the way it's being filled, what I want to do is, in order to speed up the population, I'm going to turn off decay near foreign objects because there's nothing in here that's going to affect it anyway. Also keeping in mind that we do have that other terrain underneath it, so that will influence the way the population is unless we go to the terrain and we want to select in the object properties or the aspect tab. Object properties, if you're using the integrated version, there's a little icon here with a leaf on it, and that is going to be for ignoring it from ecosystem population. So that way, if we do have decay near foreign objects, this object won't be included within that. And since the trees are instances, those will not affect that decay near foreign objects. We do want to make sure that this is not showing up along that path. So we're going to go back, edit the material, and for the ground cover, we're going to edit the alpha, add in the texture map, so projected texture map, or actually we will use the unscaled projected texture map, and we can load back in that other surface, or other. And I did load in just the edited one and not the eco, just to see if we can get it to start to come in on the edges of the path. I'm going to select to connect the alpha to the grayscale output, and we also want to invert that. Another thing I want to do is set up presence value. I don't want these going on steeper slopes. I just want it to go onto flatter regions. So if we take a look at where that rock was set up before and take a look at its environment tab, our slope range goes to 58 degrees. So we can use that as a reference for the ground cover and set the max to, say, 55. So now all those steeper areas where the rock shows up, these won't show. If you want to make them start to overlap onto those areas, you could increase the value over 58 or set it at least up to 58. What I want to do is adjust the presence. I want the sticks to show up because they're kind of looking a little pokey here, pointing up a little too high. I'm going to set the presence to 0.1 and reduce the amount of those showing. And actually it looks like that is caused from the dead leaves layer. So we'll go ahead and set that to 0.5, bring the sticks back to 1. And I might end up increasing the overall density of this. 67,000 instances. Really what I think I'm going to do is set it to dynamic population and increase the density. And that way, we're only rendering what's in front of the camera, and the rest of the terrain won't be filled. We're not really worrying about shadows anymore from the forest behind, because it's just the lower level stuff that we're looking at. So let's go ahead and take a look at a render. I have the atmosphere model, lighting model set back to global ambience, so it's not going to look as good as it did before. Just get a rough idea of how it looks, paying attention to the ecosystem. It looks like there is a problem with one of my modified species. I did have the wind turned off when I created them to ensure that they weren't being distorted. It does look like that distortion that I did see with the wind on is being applied even though wind is turned off in the scene. So what I want to do for the moment is go to, and I'm pretty sure that's from the dead leaves, and remove that one for the moment from the population because it is throwing off everything in the look to be able to tell here. So we're going to delete that dead leaves or remove it from the population. And yeah, it was definitely messed up because the scale of that was really throwing everything off. So what I'm going to need to do is just edit that species and resave it. Because even the scale now of everything else was really affected by that. And the scale of the other one, it was downsizing everything else. So what I'm going to do is set these scales of the other ones to 0.2 and preview it, and we'll just have to do the dead leaves later. Get an idea, though, how this is going to look. So we'll re-render it with just the sticks and seed vegetation, and then I'll have to modify my dead leaves. So it looks like I will need to increase the scale, primarily of the sticks, but you can start to see that showing in the lower level areas, improving just kind of the look of everything. So I'm going to go to that sticks and increase that to 0.4. Seeds we'll go ahead and do 0.3. I also want to increase my density a little bit. Take my sampling quality boost, set it to 1, and then take a look at another render. So it's a lot more filled in now. What looks like it's happening is, even though I had the length reduced to widen the leaves on the seed layer, because there is a leaf in there, it just looks like maybe it is applying or stretching out too much, doesn't quite match. For the most part, you can really kind of get an idea. I think I want to mix some other materials into here, or sorry, some other types of vegetation, because right now it's way too dense with all of the sticks. But we can also see that we have it starting to come in on the path a little bit because it is using that other image. So it does look a little bit better. Lighting needs to be changed, but we can see more detail in the procedural terrain already than there was before. So I've added in another dead leaves that I had created when making the training for getting started with View 8. So dead leaves 3, that will be included. I've gone ahead and decreased the density a little bit, and I'm going to add in now rocks. It's going to ask if I'd like to add color variations. I'm going to select no. Now, because I've also set the density so high and everything else, I'm not quite sure how big the rocks are going to be. It might take a little bit longer to populate, so what I'm going to do is bring down the density for the moment and just preview it with the lower density, just so I can see the scale of the rocks. Hopefully we can see some within the OpenGL preview once they're done populating. Okay, so these rocks are rather large. What I think I want to do is bring them down in scale to, let's say, 0.04, and reduce their presence because I don't want them showing up all that much. As we reduce scale, we also increase presence, so we have to reduce the presence when we reduce the scale in order to make sure that not all that many are being created. I'm also going to set the presence to 0.08. And then that should be good. We're going to take a look, bringing back the density to where it was before. I'm going to go ahead and type in 70. Click OK. And if we want to modify the rock material, we can go over to the material list, and under Ecosystem Materials, we should find a material called Chipped. So what we're going to do is select that material and right-click and load a material. And I'm going to use something different than that default. We're going to go to Material Layers, or actually let's go over to Rocks and select, we could have it match the gray rock that was included in there, even though we made some changes to it. Or we can pick a different rock surface we want to use. Let's go ahead and use the green and brown rock. And then that's going to apply a new material to the ecosystem. What we can also do is right-click and edit the material. And because the rock scale is different than other objects, I'm going to change the scale of the material to 0.1. Actually, 0.05. And click OK, and it's going to update. And I'm going to go ahead and render this out. We can take a look before we start to modify and adjust the lighting. So we can start to see some of the rocks showing. I think I'll probably increase the presence. Also, it looks like I do need to adjust the scale of my dead leaves because I can hardly see them, which means they're more than likely tiny little patches of pixels that are showing up in random places. So I'll go ahead and increase that too. Another thing about adjusting kind of the balance between the textures and the procedurals, I think I'm going to bring down the gamma on the texture maps down to 1.8, and that way it'll balance, it should balance things a little bit better. So that way we can kind of reduce some of the lighting, improve some of the ambient quality. So I'm going to go ahead and just tweak this a little bit, and then we'll take a look at adjusting the lighting to make this look a little bit better. So there we are with the increased scale of the dead leaves looking better. Probably going to go ahead and remove this tree right here in front, 'cause it's kind of distracting. I'd like to be able to see the path stretching up a little bit further. But now I think it's time to look at some of the other lighting settings. It's pretty easy to set those up. The only thing, it really just takes a little bit longer to render. I also want to mention that because of the change converting to a procedural terrain, you may have noticed that the presence of where the rock material was showing is different, and that's because there's more detail now and more steeper slopes in different areas. If you need to kind of go in and repaint some of the areas or sculpt some of them out, for instance, on the left we lost a lot of detail from that rock surface. So what I could do is add in a rock and customize that. But we're going to take a look really kind of at the lighting now. So we're going to go up to the atmosphere editor, and of course in the spectral model, which is the best overall atmospheric model, a couple of things to pay attention to depending on what we want to do with the scene. The first thing I want to show you is just kind of a general lighting that we're going to do with the current setup. So no real additional changes, just turning on the global radiosity. And if you want just a quick preview of the settings for the radiosity, what you want to do is turn down the quality boost. In version 9, the quality boost is more sensitive. I used to use a value of -2, but now it's really distorted at that value. So -1.5 I'm going to try and just take a look. I also want to note that the optimize for outdoor rendering will create a completely different look for the radiosity, and it can be very helpful for forest type lighting. We're going to keep it on for now because it renders a lot quicker. So also turning down that quality boost just to get an idea of what it looks like. It's beneficial sometimes just to knock down the quality boost setting just to get an idea, and then when you're ready to render it out for kind of the final render, then you can up that quality boost, setting it back to 0. So we're just going to let the radiosity pre-pass render out and the final pass render over that. So as you can see, the difference is just enormous. The quality of the entire scene and the render just it's a humongous improvement. And another thing to keep in mind is the natural film response. If I turn off the natural film response, the really dark areas show up a lot better and more. So unless you have really washed out high contrast areas, you may not need to use the natural film response. Typically, if you're using the integrated version of Extreme, then you probably won't be using the film response. But overall, it looks pretty good. Still haven't deleted some of those other trees, but you can really see everything kind of coming together. So another thing I want to show you some tricks are for really kind of increasing the density of the atmosphere. I also want to note, if you want to see or have a more of an increase for the radiosity, let's say you want that the bouncing of light, and if you're really not familiar with what radiosity is, it is the light that is created from being reflected off of other objects onto the rest of the objects. So if you think about at night, how you can see the darker parts of the moon, if it's a crescent moon or a half moon, that's caused by the light bouncing off the Earth, bouncing back to the moon, and that lights the other areas. It's basically the same thing. It's that is called Earth shine. So technically, The real term is earthshine, but as we recreate it in a computer, it's called radiosity. And it's the bouncing of light between other objects, and it works with color, so that if you have something green next to something else, that color does affect the other object. So we can increase the gain or the boost of that. A value of 1 is actually quite high, and if you increase the light balance as well, adding more sunlight, since the light is brighter, it will also impact the radiosity and make it stronger. So a lot of times you'll read, maybe in different Eon documentation, you should set it more towards ambient light whenever you're using radiosity, but I like to increase the gain and set it more towards sunlight because I think it looks better. A lot of different ways you can manage it. So really quick, I'm going to just show you, I'm going to do a small render with that increased gain, just so you can see the difference. So here's the render. You can really see more of an increased color bleed, and that light kind of giving everything more of a green glow along the trees. The natural film response, you can see it much clearer. So the gain, you can adjust that and get a lot of different atmospheric moods and things like that. The bias color is really kind of your darkest color. If you want to have a green look to everything, if you want to say, well, it's in this type of an environment, so it's going to have this kind of general color. So in a forest, we are going to have a general kind of green-yellow color. We can add a dark green or yellow, and that'll take the darkest points of that indirect light and kind of spread it throughout. For now, I'm going to go ahead and remove that, and I'm going to show you something you can do with the atmosphere. And this is just kind of a quick way. There are lots of ways you can use the haze and fog. We could add fog to the scene just by increasing the amount and then the altitude. The only thing is that is a fog based on a height and not so much based on a depth amount. So if you need to, and I'm going to go ahead and bring that back, the aerial perspective is the density of the atmosphere. The more we increase the aerial perspective, it basically it's typically used to simulate being very high in the atmosphere. So if you wanted to see the point where the atmosphere is going to start to curve and you're basically in space, you could set it to a very high aerial perspective and it will really increase that atmosphere. But when they're on the ground, what we can do is intensify the fog and haze densities with this value. So if I set this to an aerial perspective of, say, 20, it's going to work really well with the glow intensity, because the glow intensity illuminates the fog and haze, and the denser the atmosphere is, the more of a foggy type look we're going to get. So with the light, I'm going to send it back just to global ambience. Even though it's going to look great with radiosity, it's going to take a little longer to render. I just want to render this out pretty quickly. So I'm going to set it back to global ambience. We can just take a look at that increased atmospheric. So you can really see increasing sort of the ozone or the total kind of fog level and haze within everything. So it's kind of a neat way to be able to modify the atmosphere and add a little bit of depth. Also keeping in mind that you could just use the Z-depth layer if you're going to be using compositing software. Just using that with a screen or overlay type of filter or lighten, you can also add atmospheric that way too. Saving in EXR format is definitely the best for Z-depth. But even with the radiosity off, because there's such of a nice transition between the atmospheric and the way the haze is set up, you really don't need to have those other lighting styles on. Another thing to keep in mind is the ambient light color, which right now, and the ambient light color effects, and I'm just going to go ahead and save the current light just by dragging it over into one of these empty spots here. It affects the atmosphere, haze and fog around the horizon a lot, lighting on clouds, and all of the ambient light within the scene. So we can really create some interesting looks to the scene by darkening the ambient light color or using a different color of ambient light rather than working in the grayscale. So just setting this down to something a little darker, go ahead and take a look. So everything's a little bit darker now for the most part. Also, this works better now with the natural film response, where film response actually enhances it rather than washing it out. Another thing too is if we reduce our light balance to more ambient, it's going to reflect or use more of that darker color. So I'm just going to render out another one with a lower value, setting it more towards ambient light. Keeping in mind too that the atmosphere itself, and because we have the aerial perspective so high, that does remove shadows. So the higher the aerial perspective, the more distance there is, the less shadows are showing. So keep that in mind. Go ahead and take a look, let this finish out. In this case, it's not really that big of a change. I think a lot of it has to do with the glow intensity that I have on the atmosphere. I'm going to go ahead and set that to a balance of 50. Also, too, I still have my quality boost down really low. That could also impact that. Going back to the glow intensity, if we go ahead and reduce this down to 15, we should see a difference overall in the way the light is being distributed and kind of spread out. So now the sun's highlights are showing up a lot better, and the balance between everything, obviously there's a less glow, because of the glow intensity. And then we can adjust the scattering and the range of that with the setting below it. But we can modify the atmospheric so much with even tiny changes. It's really something you got to go through and just kind of play with everything. A good idea is to start with a simple scene. This is a fairly complex scene, just because we have so much vegetation. It takes a little longer to render, and so changing something and then rendering it can be pretty time-consuming. So I would just suggest setting up a much lighter scene, just a couple of plants, and go through the atmospheric settings and just change everything and see what it looks like, what sort of impact it has. Also, paying attention to the render preview on the right with a lighter scene that will update more frequently, so you can really see the changes immediately, because there's so many different things you can do with the atmosphere, and it really affects the entire look and output depending on some of these settings. So it's definitely something you gotta, I think, spend some time with in order to understand entirely. So just one last thing I'm going to show you before I finish this up. What I want to do is add a rock, and I was talking before about adding a rock to that area over on the left. And right now, everything is becoming really slow because of the shader model that I'm working with right now. And with me recording the screen, it kind of slows stuff down. So really quick, I'm going to go into the terrain, primarily with the different ecosystems here, and just set the display quality to none. And that should hopefully speed things up a little bit. And it does appear to be a lot more responsive. So every time you create a rock, it will create a new rock. So as you add one in, it's an entirely different shape. What I want to do is add, just switch over to the top viewport. And what I want to do is tuck that into the terrain, because that one spot right there just didn't look very good. And then I'm going to increase the scale a little bit, and just kind of fit it in there, moving it down. And I'm going to be applying a new surface to it. Go ahead and load in a rock surface. We'll use the gray rock. And I might need to modify this. We'll set it to 0.2 for the scale. Actually 0.05. And we may have to modify the color. But the detail of these rocks is very low polygon. So what I want to do is go to edit the object, because you can see the polygon's only 768. And keeping in mind, too, that these are triangles, so it's really kind of half of that, if you think about it, as the overall polygon amount, because usually working with quads in other applications, View, everything's triangles. What we're going to do is use the turbo mesh, or turbo smooth mesh subdivision. So I edited the object to open the polygon mesh options. What we're going to do is just set the alliterations to 1. And there's a couple of different versions here. If you're working with quads, which would be an imported object, you can use the Catmull-Clark. And there's also another method which is dynamic, so that it's going to subdivide based on the camera's position to the object. So that way you could have it subdivide as the camera gets closer. We're just going to use loop triangle, set the alliteration to 1. And that's going to double our resolution and smooth it out, make it look a lot better. So I just want to adjust the rotation. And if we need to, we can use a different object or create another type of rock. But I just want to tuck that in, just to cover up that area that wasn't looking very good. I might end up applying, like I said, a different material to it, because it is the scale doesn't look like it's appearing great right now. Well, we could also apply our displacement mapping or use a hyperblob object, but that should be good. Another thing, I want to remove that other tree. So we're going to go to the first terrain of the ecosystem layer. This should be a small tree. I believe it is the alder late spring, the second one in the list. So we're going to go to paint, and we're going to select that tree in the list. And from the bottom where it says paint what, only selected item. So that way, as we choose to the eraser, it is only going to erase that plant. And we have a lot of them kind of doubled up here. So I'm going to see if I can just click right there and remove it. So now we can close that out, click OK. And now that tree is gone. And we have a new rock. So if we just want to focus on how the rock looks, we can use that render area and just render that small portion. As we can see, that not a lot of detail on that. So probably just use a different material. Also, if I wanted to, I could go back and paint some of the vegetation, the ground vegetation around the rock or on top of it, in order to improve just the overall look of everything. So I think that pretty much wraps it up for this scene. It's very dense with vegetation for the most part, and besides getting into what you can do for really, really close-up vegetation, which is an entirely different matter, I think the scene's pretty much finalized. So hopefully you had learned a few things and got a couple ideas for what you can do, just kind of generally, within View to create a forest and modify terrains and a little bit of painting and some atmospherics.